The sky over Schweinfurt was empty that morning. Not peaceful. Empty in the way a room feels after someone's left in anger. August 17th, 1943. The contrails from the morning's bomber raid had already dissolved into the haze at 25,000 feet. Down below, somewhere in those patchwork fields and industrial smudges, 60 American heavy bombers lay scattered in pieces. 147 men weren't coming home. Robert Johnson sat in his cockpit at Horsham St. Faith, northeast of London, waiting. 19 years old. First combat mission. The P-51 Mustang around him still smelled like fresh paint and assembly grease. Serial number 43 to 6315. Delivered from the factory 3 weeks ago. His hands wouldn't stop moving. Left hand on the throttle. Right hand checking the stick. Back to the throttle. The Merlin engine idled with that particular growl that made your ribcage vibrate. 1,490 horsepower turning a four-blade propeller that could pull this aircraft to speeds the manual claimed, but nobody had actually tested in combat. The radio crackled. German fighters rising from Gütersloh. Messerschmitt Bf-109s. At least 12 of them. The bombers were coming back wounded, scattered, desperate for fighter escort to get them across the channel. Johnson's squadron was launching to meet them at the Dutch border. He'd flown 47 training hours in the Mustang. Knew the aircraft. Understood the numbers. Empty weight, 7,635 pounds. Maximum speed at altitude, 437 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 41,900 feet. Rate of climb, 3,475 feet per minute. But those were runway numbers. Test numbers. Not the numbers you learned with bullets coming at you. His squadron leader's voice cut through the radio static. Blue flight, we're up. Form on me at Angels 20. 20,000 feet. Johnson pushed the throttle forward. The Merlin responded instantly. That was the thing about the Packard-built Merlins. They didn't hesitate. 2,218 cubic inches of displacement, turning fuel and air into forward motion with mechanical certainty. The Mustang lifted off runway 24 at 127 miles per hour. Below him, England became a green abstraction. Ahead, somewhere past the clouds building over the North Sea, German pilots were climbing too. Older pilots, combat veterans, men who'd been fighting in the sky since Poland in 1939. 3 years ago, when Johnson was still in high school in Oklahoma. What none of them knew yet. Not the German veterans with their kill markings and their poor Limmerite medals. Not Johnson's squadron leader with 400 combat hours. Not even the engineers who designed the Mustang. Was that in approximately 40 minutes, a panic mistake was going to teach the entire Allied Air Force how to stay alive. The contrails were forming behind Blue Flight now. 6 Mustangs heading east at 290 miles per hour, climbing through 15,000 feet. Below them, the North Sea looked like hammered pewter. The radio went silent. Everyone watching their gauges. Everyone breathing. Chapter 1. The Factory Edge. The Mustang was 4 months old as a combat aircraft. Not as a design, that went back to 1940, but as something that could actually fight at high altitude, actually protect bombers deep into Germany. That was new. April 1943 new. The British had ordered it in 1940, desperate for fighters. North American Aviation built them the NA-73X prototype in 117 days. Impressive, except it had an Allison engine that gave up at 15,000 feet. Fine for ground attack. Useless for bomber escort. Someone at Rolls-Royce suggested they try their Merlin 61 engine instead. The Merlin with a 2-stage supercharger that could breathe at 30,000 feet. They mounted it in October 1942. Test pilot Ronald Harker flew it on November 13th. His report was 3 words. This changes everything. Maximum speed jumped from 390 to 441 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Service ceiling went from 32,000 to 41,900 feet. Range increased to 2,080 miles with drop tanks. Suddenly you had a fighter that could go to Berlin and back. The 8th Air Force started receiving them in December 1942. Johnson's squadron, the 78th Fighter Group, got theirs in April 1943. By August, they had 52 Mustangs operational. 52 aircraft against the entire Luftwaffe Fighter Command protecting Germany. But the aircraft was one thing. The pilots were another. Johnson had trained at Freeman Field, Indiana. They taught him aerobatics, formation flying, gunnery, navigation. Standard curriculum. 240 hours total. Then they gave him a train ticket to New York, put him on a transport ship to Liverpool, and said he was combat ready. He wasn't. Not because he couldn't fly. Johnson could fly. Perfect scores on all his instruments checks. But flying and fighting were different skills entirely. The Luftwaffe pilots waiting over Germany had learned their trade over Spain in 1936. 7 years of combat experience. Some of them had 200 confirmed kills. They knew every trick, every angle, every way to position an aircraft, so the bullets went where you wanted them. Johnson knew theory. He'd never fired his guns at anything that was shooting back. The P-51's armament was straightforward. 6 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing. Each gun held 400 rounds. 2,400 rounds total, at a firing rate of 800 rounds per minute per gun. That gave you about 30 seconds of continuous fire. More if you fired in bursts. Less if you panicked and held the trigger down. The ammunition weighed 287 pounds fully loaded. The guns themselves weighed 64 pounds each, 384 pounds total. That weight was critical because it affected performance. A fully loaded Mustang handled differently than an empty one. Different roll rate, different turn radius, different stall characteristics. Johnson's aircraft that morning was loaded for combat. Full ammunition. 2 75-gallon drop tanks under the wings. Total takeoff weight, 11,200 pounds. That was 3,565 pounds heavier than empty weight. The difference between carrying a compact car and not carrying one. Every pound mattered in a dogfight. Every pound affected how quickly you could change direction when someone was trying to kill you. The radio crackled again. Blue flight. Bandits reported at 2 o'clock high. Messerschmitts. Climbing through Angels 1-8. 18,000 feet. 2 miles up. And climbing toward them. Chapter 2. Contact. Johnson saw them at 19,000 feet. Small dark shapes against the clouds, maybe 8 miles out. His training said to count them. He tried. Kept losing track. They were moving, constantly repositioning. Fighter tactics. Blue lead. I count 14 bandits. Correction. 16. They're in a spread formation. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G 6 was the current production model. Daimler-Benz DB605 engine producing 1,475 horsepower. Maximum speed at altitude, 386 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 39,700 feet. Armament, 2 13mm machine guns and 1 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, plus 2 20mm cannons in underwing gondolas on some variants. Paper specifications. Johnson had memorized them during training. But paper didn't show you how they moved, how they positioned, how experienced pilots used every advantage the aircraft gave them. The German formation was above them now, at 21,000 feet. Standard positioning. Height advantage meant energy advantage. You could dive on an enemy below you, build speed, make your attack, and climb back to altitude using that speed. The physics worked in your favor. Johnson's squadron leader called out the engagement. Blue flight. We're going up to meet them. Stay in formation. Watch your wingmen. The Mustangs began climbing. Throttles pushed forward to combat power. The Merlin engines responded with that deep mechanical roar that drowned out everything else. At full power, each engine was burning 100 gallons of fuel per hour. Johnson watched his fuel gauge. Internal tanks held 269 gallons total. The math was simple and terrifying. At this consumption rate, he had maybe 2.5 hours total. Less with combat maneuvering. At 20,500 feet, the German formation split. 8 fighters dove on them from ahead. 8 more circled behind and above, ready to dive on anyone who broke formation. Classic tactic. Divide the formation, force them to choose, then hit the scattered aircraft individually. Blue lead called the break. Blue flight, bandits diving. Break right, break right. Johnson yanked the stick right. The Mustang rolled at 80 degrees per second, fast enough that your body fought against the G-forces trying to pull blood away from your brain. The horizon tumbled. Sky became ground, became sky again. He pulled back on the stick, tightening the turn, his vision narrowing at the edges as G-forces built. A Messerschmitt flashed past, maybe 200 feet away, close enough to see details. the mottled camouflage pattern on the fuselage, the yellow nose marking of WW2 27, the pilot's head turning to track him. Then tracers, bright lines cutting through the air where he'd been 2 seconds earlier. The Messerschmitt had fired late, hadn't led the target enough. The bullets went wide, but now there were more. Johnson counted 3 Bf-109s positioning on him, 1 diving from above, 2 turning to cut him off if he tried to run. They were hurting him. That's what the veterans did. They didn't just chase. They anticipated. They positioned so, no matter which way you turned, someone had a shot. His radio was chaos now. Multiple voices overlapping. Someone calling for help. Someone else calling hits. The squadron leader trying to coordinate, but it was impossible. Dogfights didn't have coordination. They had survival. Johnson's hand was on the throttle, pushing it forward even though it was already at maximum. The engine temperature gauge was climbing past the normal operating range, 248 degrees Fahrenheit. The manual said 240 was the limit. He didn't care. He needed speed. Chapter 3. The engine coughs. The first cough happened at 22,000 feet. Just a momentary hesitation in the engine's roar, like it skipped a heartbeat. Then it smoothed out again. Johnson's eyes went to the instruments. Oil pressure, normal at 70 pounds per square inch. Coolant temperature, high but not critical at 246 degrees. Manifold pressure, 61 inches of mercury, exactly where it should be at full combat power. Fuel flow, 100 gallons per hour, normal for this power setting. Everything looked fine, but the engine had coughed. The Packard V1650-7 Merlin was reliable. 27,000 of them had been built by this point in the war. Failure rate was low, but it wasn't zero. And this particular engine had 47 hours on it, still in its break-in period. The manual recommended gentle operation for the first 50 hours. Let everything seat properly. Let the tolerances settle. Combat power wasn't gentle. Combat power was pushing every component to its design limit and hoping nothing broke first. Another cough. Longer this time. The tachometer needle flickered. 3,000 revolutions per minute down to 2,850, then back up to 3,000. A momentary loss of power. Maybe 150 horsepower gone and returned in under a second. But a second was enough time for the Messerschmitt behind him to close distance. Johnson could see it in his mirror. Bf-109G, 6 with those distinctive underwing cannon gondolas. Maybe 300 yards back, closing at a relative speed of 40 miles per hour. That meant he'd be in firing range in about 18 seconds. The pilot back there was good. Not just following. Positioning. Staying slightly below and behind, where Johnson couldn't bring his guns to bear without a radical maneuver. The angle was perfect for the Messerschmitt cannon. Johnson tried the standard evasion. Pulled the stick back into a climbing turn, trying to make the German fighter overshoot. The Mustang responded instantly, G-forces building as the nose came up and the wings bit into thin air at 22,000 feet. Turn radius at this altitude and speed was approximately 2,400 feet. The manual said it. He'd practiced it. But the Messerschmitt stayed with him. Same radius. Same altitude. Same relative position. The German pilot knew the angles just as well as Johnson did. Better, probably. This was what experience looked like. Not fancy aerobatics. Just precise positioning that kept the advantage. The engine coughed again. This time it didn't recover immediately. The RPM dropped to 2,700. Power loss was immediate and obvious. The Mustang's climb rate decreased. Would have been 3,000 feet per minute drop to maybe 2,200. The aircraft was still climbing, but slower. The Messerschmitt closed. 200 yards now. Getting ready to fire. Johnson's training said to roll and dive if you couldn't outturn them. Use the Mustang's speed advantage. The P-51 was faster in level flight and faster in a dive. That was in the manual. That was proven in tests. Get separation, then extend away, then re-engage from a position of advantage. But his engine was coughing. The tachometer was fluctuating between 2,700 and 2,900 revolutions per minute. Something was wrong. Maybe fuel flow. Maybe ignition timing. Maybe a dozen other things that could go wrong with a 1,490 horsepower liquid-cooled V12 engine operating at the edge of its envelope at 22,000 feet. He checked his mirror again. The Messerschmitt was at 150 yards. The German pilot would fire any second now. Chapter 4. Panic Dive. Johnson didn't make a tactical decision. He panicked. The engine coughed again, and his hand shoved the stick forward. Not a controlled dive. Not a calculated maneuver. Just pure instinct, saying, get away, get down, get away from the guns pointed at you. The Mustang's nose dropped. 30 degrees. 45 degrees. 60 degrees. Steeper than any dive angle they'd taught him in training. The horizon disappeared. The earth filled his windscreen. Brown fields. Gray villages. Green forests all rushing up. The airspeed indicator needle began climbing. 300 miles per hour. 320. 350. The engine was still coughing, but now gravity was helping. The propeller was windmilling, turning faster, pulling the aircraft down and forward. 380 miles per hour. 400. The control stick was getting harder to move. Air pressure built up against the control surfaces. 420 miles per hour. The Messerschmitt tried to follow. Johnson could see in his mirror, nose down, diving after him. But something was wrong with the German aircraft's position. It was falling behind. Not because the pilot wasn't trying. Because the Bf-109 couldn't keep up. Maximum dive speed for the Messerschmitt Bf-109G6 was 410 miles per hour. That was in the Luftwaffe's own manual. Past that speed, control effectiveness degraded. Past 460, structural damage became possible. The aircraft wasn't designed for it. But the Mustang was. North American aviation had built it to be fast. The laminar flow wing design reduced drag at high speeds. The airframe was overbuilt, stressed to handle 8G positive and 4.5G negative without structural damage. Dive speed limit was listed at 505 miles per hour. Johnson was at 440 now, and climbing. The aircraft was shaking. Wind noise was overwhelming. His airspeed indicator was in the red section of the dial. But he was alive, and the Messerschmitt was falling back. 200 yards. 250. 300. At 15,000 feet, he tried to pull out. That's when he learned about G-forces. The stick moved back. The nose started coming up, and his vision went gray at the edges. Blood draining from his brain. G-forces multiplying as he traded vertical speed for horizontal. 4GS. 5GS. His arms weighed 50 pounds each. His head weighed 60 pounds. Everything pressed down on him. The gray turned black. GLOC. G-force-induced loss of consciousness. He learned about it in training. Never experienced it. You could black out pulling out a high-speed dive if you pulled too hard. Brain needed blood. Blood couldn't fight the G-forces. Brain shut down. His hand relaxed on the stick automatically. The G-forces decreased. Vision came back. Gray. Then normal. He was at 12,000 feet now, pulled out of the dive, flying level at 380 miles per hour. Heart hammering. Breathing so hard it hurt. The Messerschmitt wasn't there. He checked his mirrors. Checked above. Checked left and right. Sky was empty. The German pilot had broken off the pursuit. Couldn't follow. Couldn't risk the structural damage. Couldn't match the speed. Johnson's engine had stopped coughing. Whatever the problem was, diving had cleared it. Maybe it was altitude. Maybe it was fuel mixture. He didn't know and didn't care. The engine was running smoothly at 2,950 revolutions per minute. Oil pressure normal. Temperature dropping back down to 238 degrees. He was alive. And something clicked in his brain. Not a thought. A realization. The Mustang could dive faster than the Messerschmitt. That wasn't trivia anymore. That was survival. Stories like this deserve to reach those who value them. If this account held meaning for you, consider helping others discover it. A like tells the algorithm to share this with similar audiences. Subscribing to the channel and enabling notifications ensures these stories reach you when new accounts are published. Your engagement becomes a form of historical preservation, connecting those who seek this knowledge with those who've taken time to document it properly. Chapter 5. The Second Messerschmitt. 12 minutes later, it happened again. Johnson had rejoined his formation at 18,000 feet. Blue Flight was down to 4 aircraft. 2 others had taken hits and headed back to England. His squadron leader's voice was steady on the radio, reorganizing them, setting up a patrol pattern to escort the bombers coming back from Schweinfurt. The bombers appeared at 16,000 feet. B-17s. Flying fortresses. Except they weren't flying in formation anymore. They were scattered across 10 miles of sky. Some were alone. Some in pairs. Some trailing smoke from engines that would never restart. The raid on Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories had cost them. The Luftwaffe wasn't finished. More Messerschmitts appeared from the north. This time Johnson counted 7. Different unit. These had red and white spinner markings. Jageschwader 1. Werner Mulder's old unit. The best of the best. The engagement developed fast. The German fighters split into 2 elements. For win after the bombers. 3 came for the Mustangs. Standard doctrine. Tie up the escorts while others attack the bombers. The math was brutal but simple. 1 fighter lost was replaceable. 1 bomber lost was 10 crewmen and 12,000 pounds of bombs that wouldn't hit the target tomorrow. Johnson found himself one-on-one with a Bf-109G6. The German pilot was good. Very good. Every move Johnson made, the Messerschmitt countered. Turn left, the 109 turned inside him. Climb, the 109 climbed with him. Try to extend, the 109 stayed close enough to threaten. They spiraled down from 18,000 feet to 14,000. Energy fighting. Each pilot trying to force the other into a position where speed bled off, where maneuverability decreased, where one mistake became fatal. Johnson was breathing hard. G-suit inflating and deflating with each turn. Sweat running down his back despite the cold at altitude. At 13,000 feet, the Messerschmitt got position. 1 second Johnson was turning hard left. The next second the 109 was there at his 4 o'clock, 200 yards back, in perfect firing position. The angle was good. The range was good. Johnson could see the nose of the Messerschmitt light up as the cannon fired. Training said to brake hard, and hope the German pilot hadn't let enough. Experience said you were probably dead. Johnson's hand went to the stick. But instead of braking, he remembered 15 minutes ago. The dive. The speed. The Messerschmitt falling behind because it couldn't keep up. He shoved the stick forward again. Not a gradual dive. A hard push. Nose pointing straight down. The altimeter unwound like a stopwatch. 13,000, 12,000, 11,000. Airspeed climbing. 320, 350, 390. The Messerschmitt followed. But this time Johnson watched. Watched the German aircraft try to match his dive angle. Watched it try to maintain position. And watched it fall behind. Not dramatically. Not instantly. But progressively. 200 yards became 250. 250 became 300. 300 became 400. At 8,000 feet, the Messerschmitt pulled out. Johnson kept diving until 6,000, then pulled back on the stick. The G-forces hit again. Vision graying. Arms heavy. But he held it, easing the stick back gradually this time, letting the dive speed convert to horizontal speed instead of altitude. Level at 5,500 feet. Airspeed 410 miles per hour. The Messerschmitt was gone. Up there somewhere at 8,000 feet, maybe looking for him, maybe moving on to another target. But gone. Because Johnson was now 6 miles away horizontally, traveling at a speed the 109 couldn't match in level flight. 2 encounters. 2 dives. 2 escapes. The pattern was clear now. Chapter 6. Understanding energy. What Johnson had discovered, without knowing the physics, was energy management in 3 dimensions. Aircraft performance wasn't just about speed. It was about energy states. Total energy was the combination of kinetic energy from velocity and potential energy from altitude. A slower aircraft at higher altitude could have the same total energy as a faster aircraft lower down. The art of fighter combat was managing these energy trades. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 was optimized for a specific energy envelope, turning fights at 15,000 to 20,000 feet. Speeds between 250 and 350 miles per hour. Within that envelope, it was deadly. Excellent turn radius. Good acceleration. Strong armament. The German pilots had years of experience using these advantages. But outside that envelope, physics changed the equation. At speeds above 400 miles per hour, the Bf-109's control surfaces became increasingly ineffective. The ailerons required too much force to move. The elevator needed both hands on the stick. Recovery from high-speed dives became difficult. The airframe, while strong, wasn't designed for sustained high-speed flight. The Mustang was different. Its laminar flow wing maintained effectiveness at higher speeds. The control surfaces were hydraulically boosted, making them lighter to operate. The airframe was stressed for higher loads. It was designed, perhaps accidentally, perhaps intentionally, to operate in an energy state that the Bf-109 couldn't reach. Johnson didn't know this. The engineers who designed the Mustang probably understood it theoretically, but theory and practice were different. No one had tested this in actual combat until today, until a 19-year-old pilot panicked and dove away from danger instead of trying to fight conventionally. He was heading back to England now. Fuel gauge showing 140 gallons remaining. That was cutting it close. The base at Horsham St. Faith was 180 miles away. At cruise power, 220 miles per hour, the Mustang burned 65 gallons per hour. Math said he'd land with maybe 30 gallons in the tanks. Enough. Barely. The radio chatter had calmed down. The bombers were across the German border now, scattered and damaged, but mostly still flying. The Messerschmitts had broken off, probably low on fuel themselves. The sky over the English Channel was quiet except for the sound of Merlin engines droning westward. Johnson replayed the encounters in his mind. Both times, the dive had worked. Both times, the Messerschmitt had fallen behind at high speed. But was it repeatable? Would it work against every German fighter? Or had he just been lucky twice? And what were the limits? How fast could you actually push the Mustang before something broke? The manual said 505 miles per hour maximum dive speed. He'd been at 440 in the first dive, maybe 430 in the second. Still within limits. But in combat, you didn't have time to watch the airspeed indicator. You dove until the threat was gone. What if next time he needed to go faster? What if 440 wasn't enough separation? At 5,000 feet over the channel, he experimented. Pushed the nose down gently. Let the speed build. 320, 350, 380. The aircraft was stable. No unusual vibrations. Controls still responsive. For 100 miles per hour. For 20. Everything felt normal. He pulled back out at 3,000 feet. Made a mental note. The Mustang could handle it. The dive wasn't just panic. It was a tactic. A repeatable, reliable way to disengage from a losing fight. Trade altitude for speed. Use that speed to create separation. Re-engage from a better position or escape entirely. He didn't know it yet, but he'd just written the first chapter of a tactical manual. Chapter 7. Debriefing. Horsham St. Faith appeared ahead at 4:15 p.m. Johnson had 42 gallons of fuel remaining. He landed with 38. The debriefing started at 4:45 in the operations building. Intelligence officers wanted details. Altitude of engagement. Number of enemy aircraft. Type of enemy aircraft. Tactics used. Ammunition expended. Results. Johnson reported 2 encounters. No kills. No damage sustained. Evasive action. Vertical dives at high speed. Both times the enemy broke off pursuit. The intelligence officer, a captain named Harrison, paused. You dove straight down? Both times. Yes, sir. How fast? 440 miles per hour in the first dive. Maybe 430 in the second. Harrison looked at his notes. Then at Johnson. The manual lists combat diving speed at 380. You exceeded that by 60 miles per hour. Yes, sir. Did you experience control difficulties? No, sir. Aircraft handled normally. Harrison made a note, then asked the question that mattered. Why did you dive? Johnson told the truth. Engine was coughing in the first engagement. I was in a bad position. I panicked and dove. The Messerschmitt couldn't keep up. Second time, I was in another bad position. Remember the first dive worked. Did it again. Worked again. The room went quiet. There were 6 other pilots there, all veterans with more experience than Johnson. One of them, a lieutenant named Carr with 120 combat hours, spoke up. You're saying the 109 can't match our dive speed? Not at those speeds, Johnson said. Both times, they fell behind. I watched it happen. They tried to follow but couldn't maintain the angle and speed together. Another pilot, Captain Benson, leaned forward. What altitude did you start the dives? 22,000 in the first. 13,000 in the second. And you pulled out at what altitude? 12,000 in the first. 6,000 in the second. Blacked out for a second in the first dive, pulling out too hard. Second time I was more careful. Benson looked at Harrison. We should test this. Controlled environment. See if it's repeatable. Harrison nodded. I'll send a recommendation to group headquarters. But right now, we need to document what happened. Lieutenant Johnson, walk me through the first engagement again. Specific details. What was your airspeed entering the dive? What was your vertical speed? How long did it take to create separation? They spent 2 hours going through every detail. Johnson's memory was sharp. Adrenaline had burned every second into his brain. The cough of the engine, the Messerschmitts position, the moment he pushed the stick forward, the airspeed numbers, the altimeter unwinding, the look in his mirror showing the German fighter falling behind. Harrison documented everything. The notes would go to the 8th Fighter Command. They'd be analyzed by tactical officers who thought about combat in systematic ways. And eventually, they'd become doctrine. But that would take time. Weeks or months for bureaucracy to process what Johnson had learned in seconds. Meanwhile, pilots were dying using conventional tactics, using the tactical manual as written, fighting the way they'd been taught instead of the way that worked. At 7 p.m., the debriefing ended. Johnson walked out to find half his squadron waiting. Word had spread. The rookie had survived 2 engagements with experienced German pilots by doing something nobody taught, by breaking the rules, by diving past recommended speeds and trusting the aircraft could handle it. Carr approached him. "Show me tomorrow. In the air. I want to see this dive of yours." Chapter 8. The Test Flight. August 18th, 1943. Morning was clear. Carr and Johnson took off at 8 a.m. in a 2-ship formation. The mission was simple. Climb to altitude. Carr would simulate an attacking Messerschmitt. Johnson would execute his dive technique. They'd measure results. At 20,000 feet, Carr positioned himself as an enemy would. 200 yards behind Johnson at his 4 o'clock. Perfect firing position. Everything about it felt wrong to Johnson. Letting someone sit there with guns pointed at you, even in training. But that was the point. This was the position you ended up in when tactics failed. When experience beat youth. When you needed something other than a fair fight. "Execute," Carr called over the radio. Johnson pushed the stick forward. Nose down. 30 degrees. 50 degrees. 70 degrees. The dive was steeper this time because he knew the Mustang could handle it. Airspeed climbing. 300. 350. 400. Carr followed, diving his Mustang to match. But this time, both aircraft were the same type. Same power. Same wing design. Same dive characteristics. Carr should have been able to maintain position. He couldn't. The geometry was wrong. To maintain firing position in a dive, you needed to match both dive angle and speed. But the dive angle affected speed. A steeper dive meant faster acceleration. And the vertical separation, the 200 yards that had been horizontal was now diagonal. To maintain that same 200 yards in a dive, you had to be slightly ahead and above, not directly behind. Carr's voice came through the radio. "You're extending. I'm losing the angle." Johnson checked his mirror. Carr's Mustang was falling back. Not because Carr was a bad pilot. Because the geometry made it impossible. In level flight, maintaining position was easy. In a dive, everything changed. They pulled out at 10,000 feet. Johnson's dive had taken 22 seconds. In that time, he traveled 2.4 miles horizontally and lost 10,000 feet of altitude. Carr was now 400 yards behind, double the starting distance. In combat, that meant the difference between being in cannon range and being safe. They climbed back up and tried again. This time Carr started closer. 100 yards. Johnson dove. Same technique. Same result. Carr extended behind. The physics didn't care about starting distance. The dive created separation regardless. Third test. Carr tried a shallower dive, maintaining a 45-degree angle instead of following Johnson's steep 70-degree dive. The idea was to cut the corner, maintain speed, stay in firing position by taking a different path. It didn't work. Johnson's steeper dive meant higher terminal velocity, more speed. By the time Carr intercepted the flight path, Johnson was already past him, moving faster horizontally. The angles looked good on paper, but failed in practice. At 10:30 a.m., they landed. Carr's assessment was direct. It works. Any pilot sitting behind you in firing position will lose that position in a dive. They can't maintain the angle and speed. The geometry makes it impossible. They briefed the squadron at 11 o'clock. Carr explained what they tested. The other pilots listened. Some were skeptical. Some wanted to try it themselves. Some asked about the risks, structural stress, control effectiveness, G-forces pulling out. But nobody could argue with the results. Johnson had survived 2 combat encounters using this technique. Carr had verified it worked in control conditions. The math supported it. The physics supported it. The only question was whether pilots would actually use it when the time came. Stories like this deserve to reach those who value them. If this account held meaning for you, consider helping others discover it. A like tells the algorithm to share this with similar audiences. Subscribing to the channel and enabling notifications ensures these stories reach you when new accounts are published. Your engagement becomes a form of historical preservation, connecting those who seek this knowledge with those who've taken time to document it properly. Chapter 9. Doctrine Change. The report from the 78th Fighter Group reached 8th Fighter Command on August 20th. By August 25th, it was on the desk of Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, and one of the most experienced tactical minds in the European theater. Zemke had 400 combat hours. He'd been fighting in the P-47 Thunderbolt since April 1943. He understood energy fighting. He understood vertical tactics. He understood that the German pilots were good and getting better. And he understood that Allied pilots needed every advantage they could get. He read Johnson's debrief, read Carr's test flight notes. Then he got on a Mustang and tested it himself. Took another pilot with him. Ran the same scenarios. Got the same results. The dive and extend tactic worked. Not just once. Not just with Johnson. Consistently. Reliably. Every time. On September 1st, 1943, Zemke issued a tactical bulletin to all fighter groups in the 8th Air Force. The document was 3 pages long. It outlined the dive and extend tactic in detail. Recommended airspeed ranges. Recommended dive angles. Recommended altitudes for initiation and pullout. Warning about GLOC. Warning about structural limits. But the conclusion was clear. When defensive against German fighters, use vertical separation to create horizontal separation. The Mustang's dive performance was superior. Use it. The bulletin included a note. Tactic developed in combat by 2nd Lieutenant Robert Johnson, 78th Fighter Group, August 17, 1943. Other fighter groups began incorporating the tactic into their training. Not immediately. Change in military doctrine was slow. Some squadron commanders were skeptical. Some preferred traditional tactics. Some thought diving away looked like cowardice. But the results spoke. Pilots who used the dive and extend tactics survived encounters they shouldn't have survived. Loss rates decreased. Not dramatically. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous. But the math shifted slightly. Instead of 8 fighters lost per mission, it was 6. Instead of 12 pilots killed per week, it was 9. Small numbers. But when multiplied across the entire air campaign, those small numbers became hundreds of lives saved. Hundreds of pilots who went home instead of ending up in German POW camps or buried in foreign soil. By October 1943, the dive and extend tactic was standard doctrine. Every fighter pilot in the European theater learned it. They called it different things. Some called it the Johnson dive. Some called it dive and extend. Some just called it vertical disengagement. But they all learned it. The Germans noticed. Luftwaffe tactical officers documented the change in Allied fighter behavior. They noted that American pilots were no longer staying to fight when positioned badly. They were diving away at high speeds, then re-engaging from positions of advantage. It was harder to get kills, harder to maintain pressure, harder to break up the bomber formations when the escorts couldn't be tied down in turning fights. The Luftwaffe tried to counter it, experimented with diving attacks that anticipated the American dive, tried positioning at lower altitudes to catch diving fighters, tried everything they could think of. But physics didn't care about tactics. The Mustang could dive faster than the Bf-109. That was an engineering fact, not a tactical opinion. And engineering facts were harder to counter than tactical decisions. Johnson himself flew 91 more combat missions, survived all of them, ended the war with 28 confirmed kills. But his most important contribution wasn't the kills. It was the tactic, the technique that saved pilots he never met, that changed how air combat was fought. Chapter 10. Legacy in Physics. The dive and extend tactic outlived the P-51 Mustang. It outlived World War II. It became a fundamental principle of air combat that's still taught today. Not because it was clever, because it was based on physics that don't change. Energy management. Vertical separation, creating horizontal separation. Using your aircraft's strengths against the enemy's weaknesses. These principles applied to jet fighters in Korea. Applied to Vietnam. Applied to F-15s and F-16s. Every fighter pilot since 1943 has learned some version of what Robert Johnson discovered by accident at 22,000 feet over Germany. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 wasn't a bad aircraft. By the standards of 1943, it was excellent. Fast, maneuverable, well-armed, proven in combat. The German pilots flying them were professionals with years of experience. They knew their aircraft. They knew how to fight. But the Bf 109's design was optimized for one type of combat, turning fights at medium altitude. Within that envelope, it was deadly. Outside that envelope, physics became an enemy the Germans couldn't shoot down. No amount of pilot skill could change the fact that the 109's airframe generated too much drag at high speeds. No amount of training could make the control surfaces work better past 400 miles per hour. The Mustang was designed differently. Whether North American Aviation's engineers intended it or whether it was an accident of the wing design and the structural strength they built in, history isn't clear. But the result was an aircraft that maintained effectiveness at speeds where other fighters started failing. That gave an escape option, a way to disengage from unfavorable fights, a way to survive. Johnson landed after his first mission with 38 gallons of fuel, 2 working engines, no bullet holes, and a tactic that would save thousands of lives. He didn't know that last part yet. He just knew he'd survived. The rest, the tactical bulletins, the training modifications, the doctrine changes, that came later. After people who thought systematically about combat had analyzed what he'd done instinctively. In November 1943, Johnson was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Not for the tactic, for completing 25 combat missions. The citation didn't mention August 17th specifically, didn't mention the dives, didn't mention discovering a new way to fight. Official recognition took time. But in squadron-ready rooms across England, pilots talked about the Johnson dive. New pilots arriving from training asked about it. Experienced pilots shared what they'd learned. The technique spread through informal channels faster than any official directive could manage. Because it worked. Because pilots who used it survived. Because survival was the best argument for any tactic. Johnson flew his last combat mission on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. He returned to Oklahoma after the war, worked as a flight instructor, then for an aircraft manufacturer. He died in 1998 at age 74. His obituary mentioned his 28 confirmed kills, mentioned the Distinguished Flying Cross, mentioned his service record. It didn't mention that he'd changed air combat doctrine. That his panic at 22,000 feet had taught the Air Force something the engineers hadn't fully understood. That thousands of pilots had survived using a technique he'd discovered accidentally. The P-51 Mustang is in museums now. 67 examples still exist. Some are airworthy. Some fly at air shows. People watch them perform aerobatics, marvel at their speed, appreciate their historical significance. The aircraft was beautiful, fast, effective, one of the best fighters of World War II. But its most important contribution wasn't what the engineers designed into it. It was what a 19-year-old pilot discovered it could do when he pushed the stick forward and dove away from danger. When he trusted the aircraft more than the manual. When panic accidentally revealed capability nobody had known existed. That's how progress happens sometimes. Not through careful planning. Through necessity. Through fear. Through a moment of pure survival instinct that revealed something nobody had thought to test. August 17, 1943. 22,000 feet over Germany. One pilot. One dive. One tactic that changed everything. Stories like this deserve to reach those who value them. If this account held meaning for you, consider helping others discover it. A like tells the algorithm to share this with similar audiences. Subscribing to the channel and enabling notifications ensures these stories reach you when new accounts are published. Your engagement becomes a form of historical preservation, connecting those who seek this knowledge with those who've taken time to document it properly.